Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Foundations of Learning webinar series. This is the last of our series, and I'm very excited to introduce to you Charlie, my colleague, who's going to be talking a little bit about backwards planning, which comes right after Drew's webinar about the Foundations of Learning Experience Design. So if you missed that previous webinar, feel free to check it out on our website. My name is Aya, and I head customer success here, and Charlie does instructional design here, and he has worked with numerous customers on designing online courses. Just a couple of pieces of housekeeping. If you have any questions, feel free to put it in the questions area, and I will be answering questions throughout the webinar. And if we are unable to answer a question during the webinar, we'll make sure to answer them, follow up with you after. So without further ado, here's Charlie.
All right, thank you, Aya. All right, hello everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. I would like to ask everyone a special favor, and that is during the next 29 minutes, I would like to ask for your complete and undivided attention to this webinar. So please shut down, ignore the email. The email can wait. Shut down Facebook, your friends can wait. Turn down the TV. I've got a lot of information here, and I promise you that I'll have at least 3 or 4 concepts that will be interesting and informative, food for thought, and it will be well worth your time or your money back. Okay, so having said that, let's get started. We're going to cover backwards planning today and how it relates to course design, and more specifically, online course design when you're trying to create an experiential learning environment. All right, let me describe the agenda for what we're going to cover. First, I'm going to talk about what backwards planning is and why you should do it, why you should consider it. And then the meat of this discussion will really be about the 3 main steps for backwards planning. So 3 steps backwards. Then I'll cover a case study where this has been implemented with one of NovoEd's partners, which is the Berkeley Executive Coaching Institute, based out of Berkeley, California here. And then finally, at the very end, I'll wrap up with a summary and provide just a few minutes for Q&A. As I mentioned, if you have any other questions, feel free to post them and we'll respond to them individually or after the webinar. All right, let's get started. First, a quote: begin with the end in mind. So Stephen R. Covey, the late famous management guru, in his mega seller, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, his number 2 habit was begin with the end in mind. Then everything that you do will serve a purpose. I think that's pretty intuitive for most of us. Now, what does that mean in terms of backwards planning? First, we need to define it. Here's a definition of backwards design or backwards planning. Backwards design begins with the objectives of a unit or course, what students are expected to learn and be able to do, and then proceeds backwards to create lessons that achieve those desired goals. This is essentially saying, don't start with content or concepts that you have and think about them going forward the way a learner would experience these things, but think about what you want them to be thinking and doing and be able to do at the end of your learning experience, and then work backwards and design everything to be able to support that end goal. Now, 2 twists that I want to add here in our conversation about backwards planning. The first is a philosophy of teaching and learning called project-based learning, or PBL. So project-based learning is basically the philosophy that the best way for people to learn things is by having them actively involved and creating something related to the content that they are trying to master. So if you look here on the left with Bloom's taxonomy, you've got the lower levels of learning here at the bottom, remembering, understanding, and then there are higher levels, applying, analyzing, evaluating, creating. Now, project-based learning by definition is about creating, so you are attacking that highest level of Bloom's taxonomy. But if you think about a really well-designed project experience, one that's relevant to the skills that you're trying to teach, who would doubt that in doing those projects, people really cover all of these elements of Bloom's taxonomy if they truly create an effective and meaningful project. At NovoEd, we're strong believers in project-based learning. Our learning platform really enables this type of learning environment. And so this is part of what we want to talk about in the backwards planning today. Okay, twist number 2, and that is online learning. So let me take a half step back and describe sort of a common problem that people have commented on over the past years or even decades. And that is that there's often a training environment, I'll call it, say it's a classroom or a workshop or an offsite, and people learn new things, and they can learn some pretty complicated, interesting new concepts or new things in that training environment. But the difficulty is taking what they learned and applying that into the real world. Now, why is it so hard to apply what you learn in one environment to another? I think that, again, this is rather intuitive for us, but it's really because the real world is messy. Okay, it's chaotic, it's random, it has all kinds of moving parts, all kinds of interrelated parts, and you simply can't take that nice structure of what you've learned and find a great place to apply it in the real world. In fact, it's gotten so bad that oftentimes what you'll hear some learners say is something like, well, if I only take away one thing from this training program, then it will have been worth it, or 2 things. Well, I think that's pretty sad. If we're doing multi-day training programs and people are taking away just one thing that they're applying, I think we should stop, doing multi-day training programs. Now, one approach to try to address this issue is to try to get learning to happen in the real world. So things like just-in-time training, JIT, or performance support, things like that have been tried. And I think those areas are promising, but the problem with those is that you can't teach very complex or sophisticated things in that real world environment when things are dynamic and changing. There are some types of skills, especially the higher level skills that are becoming more and more important nowadays, things related to communication, problem solving, soft skills, etc., team-based skills that really require you to learn it in a different way. So there is an advantage, however, now of teaching online with modern on-day learning platforms, and that is you can expand that training environment. So let me give you an illustration. Let's say you had a 10-hour in-person training program that was over 1.5 days. Okay. Instead of having that training in person, what if you had it online for 2 hours a week over 5 weeks? So that's still the same 10 hours, but now you've stretched that across over 5 weeks. What does that allow you to do? It allows you to do something like this. You can actually go back and forth now between the training environment and the real world and apply little pieces. So in this example, let's say you had 3 objectives you're trying to convey or teach. You take the first one, you ask people you teach them this objective, you ask them to apply it, to try it in the real world, and to come back with feedback or to come back with a self-reflection. Then you adjust, and then you work on the next objective that you have. An example of this might be, for example, if you're teaching presentation skills, and one of the components of that is, eye contact. Then maybe what you do is you give them an exercise to try in the next meeting that they have in the real world. Try these things. Make eye contact with people, count to 2 in your head, and then shift your gaze to someone else. That could be an example of an exercise that you have them apply in the real world. Maybe they get feedback from someone, and then they move on the next week and work on something else. The term I'll use for this is interweaving. So this allows you to interweave your training environment and the real world. All right, now we're ready to talk about backwards planning, and I'm going to describe it in 3 steps. So 3 steps to backwards planning. The steps are, number 1, start with the right goal. So this is that begin with the end in mind. Step 2 is create interim landmarks or milestones. And step 3 is build gradual scaffolding. Each of these steps has 2 points underneath. And at the very end, I'll summarize all of this on one page so you don't have to necessarily write it down here. Let's start with step 1, starting with the right goal. The 2 steps here, or the 2 sub-steps, are selecting an appropriate goal and defining a project and assessments. So when I talk about an appropriate goal, I mean for a given training experience or learning experience you're trying to design, what is that end state or that end goal that you want people to have? Let me describe to you an ideal goal. The ideal goal is to have people do the thing you're trying to teach them to do in the actual context where they are supposed to do it. Okay, so for example, if you're trying to teach innovation brainstorming and innovation development, maybe your goal is by the end of your learning experience for them to have developed an innovative new idea and to have tested it with actual potential users. Okay, that may not be the ultimate innovation they create 6 months later or a year later, but they are creating that actual innovation in the context of your program. It might be creating a sales account plan. Maybe this is something that you're rolling out a new account planning process, and by the end of your program, they've actually created one account plan for one of their sales accounts. Or it might be leading people through a change process that's happening in your organization. So I'm calling this ideal goal, just do it. I'm not sure where I picked up that phrase, but it seems to make sense. So that is the goal, just do it. However, I recognize that just doing it is not always the most feasible goal. So you might choose a different goal that is more appropriate for you if you can't do the ideal goal. I've got some ideas for you. One is do some of it. So perhaps you're undergoing a change management process that's going to take 3 months. Maybe in your learning experience, you can have people by the end of it actually kick off their own team meetings in planning for that change. So in that sense, you're teaching them about the whole change management process, but as part of the learning experience, you're having them actually do a kickoff meeting for that process. Another goal is prep for it. So perhaps you're teaching coaching skills to new managers, and you're coaching them on you're teaching them to have difficult conversations when people are experiencing challenges. Now, maybe you don't know if your learners are in an environment where they need to have those conversations now, but you can prepare them for it. You can have them think about it. You can have them go through role plays or simulations or exercises. You can have them plan out and think about how they would structure such conversations so that when it does occur, they will be ready to do it. And then the third is practice for it. So this might be with presentation skills, for example. You might have people do mock presentations. You might have people do role plays. So the whole point here is that we would recommend that you always strive, if you can, if possible, for the ideal goal. Have your goal of the learning experience be for them to just do it. But if that goal isn't the most appropriate for you, then pick another goal, one of these others here that you see, or something else that's appropriate for your training program. All right, now that we've thought about the goal planning process a little bit, let's talk about assessments. So the question I have about assessments is, what is it that you can measure, and what is it that, how broad is your definition of assessment? So when you talk to a lot of people about assessments, which are a very critical part of the learning and teaching process, a lot of people have a very narrow definition of assessments. And it sort of reminds me of the person who is looking for their car keys under a street lamp because that's where the light is. And unfortunately with assessments, the problem is that there are a lot of things that just can't be measured or can't be reliably measured. So the question is, can we look where the light doesn't shine, or can we be more creative about different kinds of light? We would advocate for that, of course, and try to find other kinds of light. It doesn't always have to be a quantitative, statistically reliable assessment. It doesn't have to be a quiz. There are other types of things that can be used for assessments. Let me give you some examples that we commonly see in courses. So manager feedback, mentor coaching, colleague comments. So these are things where the learner is getting feedback and they are getting a sense for how well they're mastering something. Now, you don't necessarily get to measure that, but I believe that it's more important that the learner understand and assess where they are than it is for you or I or the training designer to understand and assess them. The exception might be if you're teaching safety at a nuclear power plant or something. In that case, yes, you probably want the full, reliable assessment and so on. Some other ideas is a showcase or portfolio. This is very common in the arts, for example, where people will have a portfolio and that will be the results of what they've learned. Fellow learner input from others in the course. Self-reflection, that is a form of assessment. Producing new information, blog posts, articles, things like that. And of course, organizational results. Maybe you're teaching change management and you can actually see what those results are from teaching people those concepts. All right, so my whole point here is try to be broad in your definition of assessments. And if you're broad and you think about assessments as how can learners get feedback on how they are doing so they can assess themselves, it'll be much more powerful than just thinking about assessments narrowly as how you or I can slot people into certain stages of knowledge attainment. Next, let's talk about step 2, create interim landmarks. So there's two pieces here. First is decode the steps needed that you're trying to teach them, and then create landmarks that are mini projects. Let me describe what I mean. Let's say up here on the upper right, you've got your end goal, the one that we discussed earlier. Maybe it's the just do it goal. What you want to do then is you want to figure out what are all the different learning pieces that a person needs to experience in order to be ready for that end goal. And you break it down, maybe there's 15 or 17 different discrete pieces. You want to pick the key, the critical ones, or group some of them together and create these incremental landmarks. So the landmark is something that you want people to master, and it's important for them to gain some mastery, some level of understanding or mastery of it before they can advance and take on the next aspect of what you're trying to teach them. This is that scaffolding that I sort of referred to, going from the beginning point of where people are to the end point of the course. The question, of course, is, what do you choose for your landmarks? I think that there are 3 things that factor into that, and it's represented by the Venn diagram that you see. One is, how critical are the steps? So of the 17 steps you have, are there 5 or 6 or 3 or 4 that are very critical to really getting this? Next is, what are the gaps in knowledge? So maybe there are 3 to 4 things that are very critical, but a couple of them are quite obvious and quite easy. So criticality doesn't equate to difficulty necessarily. And you have to take into account your learner population. What sort of experience do they have? What sort of knowledge do they have? The final thing is the scope of your training or your training priorities for that particular learning experience. So if you were doing a 1-week in-person program for coaching, you might have a full day on having difficult conversations. But if you were doing, and you might have 2 or 3 milestones in that day. But if you're doing a 4-hour program for coaching, then your difficult conversations piece might only be 30 minutes. You might only have 1 landmark. So it's really a combination of these 3 different factors that dictate what your landmark should be. Now, the good news is that once you've established those landmarks, it's really easy then to divide up all of these steps into modules. So the modules are just simply sections of learning, and once someone completes a module, you have them work on that mini project. And again, that mini project is just a stepping stone towards that end goal. The mini project could focus just on one small aspect of what you're trying to teach, and it might be something that they refer to later in their end goal or refer to later in another mini project, or it might be standalone. The point is each step along the way should be achievable, should be relevant, it should be important, and then you're sort of laddering them up to the end goal that you're trying to achieve. All right, let's talk about step 3, building gradual scaffolding. Here there's 2 things that you need to do. One is to define the modules, and then to scaffold the module content. Here's a hypothetical example. Let's say we're talking about one module, developing a pitch, developing a presentation pitch. And the end goal, or that mini project in that module, is to draft a pitch. So that is to outline or write out that presentation pitch. Now note that you might have as module 4 or a later module actually delivering that pitch. So you're scaffolding them along. But for now, for the purposes of module 3, it's just simply drafting that pitch. Here's how you might structure something like this. If we start from the bottom and go up, this is the scaffolding. So first, you might want to, as an objective, have people learn what makes an effective pitch. Next, you might have them understand what some key elements are of that. And then for each element, you might want to talk about or teach them how to support those elements with evidence. And then finally, combine them into a story flow. And if you do some analysis and determine that these are the key things that they need to do in order to draft this pitch, then you can structure your module accordingly. These are your goals. Now, how do you accomplish this? Now, this is where I find it quite exciting. And I think you should approach this as having a range of tools you can use to achieve each of these. And sort of like a master craftsman, you pick the right tool for the right job at that particular point in the journey. So let me show you what that could look like. Let's say, for example, here in green are different elements in that module that you can use. So for learning what makes effective pitches, maybe you have a series of short videos that describes what effective pitches are. Maybe you have links to external content. You could also have a discussion. You could have people share what they've noticed in their own experience about what makes a successful pitch. And just sharing that is a great way to have knowledge disseminate among your learners. Next, understanding the key elements of a pitch. Maybe here to teach this, you want to introduce a framework. So maybe you do that, and then you also do a quiz. Now, the purpose of the quiz here is to reinforce the framework in people's minds. So you have a 4-step framework, and then you have a quiz to make sure that they're keeping kind of straight what each of those 4 steps are. Next, learn to support elements with evidence. Maybe here you have an assignment where people make a point and then support that with evidence. And then you have feedback, or you have a role play where people make points to each other and they try to support their points and they give feedback to each other. And then finally, combining the elements to a story flow. This might be a good opportunity for a team assignment where you have a group of people come together, pick a story that they want to deliver, and have them talk with each other and communicate with each other virtually, and really form and shape that story themselves. And that discussion of really working together really helps create a little bit of that dynamic of the project-based learning experience as a team. And then finally, you're ready for your mini project, which is drafting a pitch. And this might be an individual project because you want everyone to go through this experience. So this is just an example of how you can think about designing a module. Now, at NovoEd, we have other resources that you can take a look at that offer some perspective and advice on module design. It's a whole nother topic in and of itself. But it's important just to understand conceptually that you want to build scaffolding to start where the learner is and to build up in incremental steps to get them to where you want them to go. And the tools and technology and the approaches that you use should all be in the service of what you're trying to accomplish at that step. you shouldn't let those things dictate what that learning experience is. It's really up to you to design. All right, having said that, let me talk about a case study. I mentioned the Berkeley Executive Coaching Institute. The Berkeley Executive Coaching Institute has a long tradition of teaching in-person leadership development courses around the world. And these programs are 2, 3, 5 days. Some are even multiple weeks long. And they had never, prior to this, never done an online training program. They decided to work with NovoEd to develop their first online program, to put their toe in the water and see if they could reach more people through this medium, see if they could teach the way they wanted to teach in an online format. So what they chose was a course called Authentic Leadership Presence. And Authentic Leadership Presence is around communication skills. It's around building a self-concept. It's around really finding that authentic, these authentic roots to convey those traits as a leader. This is a skill set that they teach quite often. I had the privilege of working with the Berkeley Executive Coaching Institute early this year in planning through this, and we went through a process much like the 3 steps that I've described. So let me describe to you what the end goal was. It was a 5 to 6 week program. And again, starting with the goal, let me describe that final project or that end sort of capstone. It consisted of 4 steps. These are actually an abbreviated version of the instructions for that final project. First, identify an opportunity where you can practice your authentic leadership presence. Prepare by answering some questions, things that were covered earlier in the course. Third, identify leadership principles that you will utilize. And then fourth, execute on that opportunity. So this asks them to actually go out into the real world, into their own real environments, find an opportunity to practice what they've been learning and to actually do that. And that wasn't it. It was also to come back and reflect on how they did, what went well, what was expected, what was unexpected, and what they could have done better. A bonus, if feasible, was to ask for actual feedback from people who were at that presentation or conversation where they practiced these leadership skills. Okay, so this is an example of a little bit of a just do it along with a prep for it sort of end goal. Let me describe to you how we then look back and designed the steps along the way. So I'm showing you examples from, these are actual examples from their 5 modules. Module 1 was an introductory module and really getting to do a self-assessment and a self-reflection. This keep calm and know yourself is an example of one learner's their own submission for this assignment. This is what they sort of said for themselves. Next, in Module 2, participants were asked to create a river of life that represented their own learning journey. So they wrote out this journey that really formed the basis of their authenticity and uploaded it to share with other people, and people commented on it. Module 3, telling their leadership story, they actually recorded themselves in a 3 or 4 minute video. And then 4 is giving feedback. They watched each other's leadership stories and gave each other feedback. All right. In the last minute or so that I have, I'd like to describe, first of all, a worksheet, and I'm happy to make these slides available for you, a worksheet that we use to develop the modules for this. And you can see that it spans across all 5 modules. We started with the learning objectives, and we had similar type of content throughout in order to build our scaffolding to get to where we want it to go. Final point wrapping up, 3 steps for backwards planning. This is the summary slide. Start with the right goal, create interim landmarks, and build gradual scaffolding. I'll leave you with a quote. Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. Soren Kierkegaard. All right, given that we're out of time, we'll end our webinar here, but I hope that you took away from this some things that you can use for the online courses or any courses that you're planning. And remember to have the best course experience for learners as they move through it going forwards. Plan it backwards. From NovoEd, I want to say thank you and have a great day. Bye-bye.